Welcome to Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. I invite you to join me on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful as a participant in the great conversation, and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education. If you are a classical educator or a parent who is passionate about educating your children well, and you have been intrigued by many books such as Norms and Nobility by David Hicks, Walking on Water by Madeline L'Engle, Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, or Tending the Heart of Virtue by Vegan Gorian, this is a great episode for you to stick with. We have a guest, Dr. Danny Gabelman, who is a scholar in England on George MacDonald. I met him through the George MacDonald Society. And I have a guest co-host today, Dr. Reno Lauro, who's been on our show a few times. And so what I'd like to do is ask Danny, Dr. Gabelman, to open us up with telling us a little bit about his work and why George MacDonald is important for classical education. Welcome to the show, Danny.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. My work with George MacDonald was focused on his fairy tales in particular. And so I did a lot of work sort of looking at George MacDonald, trying to reappraise his work a little bit in the sense of not treating him as a serious, solemn Victorian preacher. Not to say that there's some of those aspects don't come out in a lot of his works, but trying to see the kind of the puckish heart at the core of George MacDonald. He's actually a very playful, light-hearted, joyous figure. And so a lot of what I was trying to do in my thesis, which has come out as a book now, is looking at what I call levity, which is, again, not necessarily just sort of stupid, frivolous, nonsensical kind of stuff. Well, he does have a lot of nonsense, but he unites it into this higher harmony, which again I like talking about as levity, which is kind of moving beyond gravity, the solemn and the serious, because that is never a final sort of stage. It might be sort of part of the journey, but it's never the highest part of that. So that's a little bit about my research with that. I'm involved with the George MacDonald Society as the academic representative, and we try to promote all things George MacDonald by running conferences and promoting his works online and through events. And I'm hoping to start a podcast like this one at some point.
So tell me why you think George MacDonald is important in the world of classical education.
Yes. So I think because one of the things that MacDonald is absolutely focused on is education itself. Is every single work that George MacDonald writes is about growth, is about development. He wouldn't necessarily, talk about it, although he does. He has loads of teachers and educators as characters within his works. In his fairy tales, I'd say, every single fairy tale has at its core the idea of development, growth in some sense. In the most fundamental sense, you could therefore say everything he writes and everything he's thinking about is about education, again, in that broadest possible sense of the word. And he writes very, very beautifully about this in all of his stories. But he also, I think, is one of the best thinkers on this subject, and in particular, the way that he draws out the importance of the imagination in education and the fundamental, profound role that the imagination has in creating learners, but also in connecting all those all parts of education together, not sort of leaving them as bits that are isolated, but unifying. That for MacDonald, the imagination is the faculty that unites into something higher and bigger and greater. So that without that, he would say, you don't really have education. You might have knowledge, you might have intellect, you might have other things, but you wouldn't have this sort of harmonious interrelationship between all the different parts.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And to prepare for this interview, we all decided to read or reread, from all of us, I guess, The Imagination, Its Function, and Its Culture, which is the first chapter in the longer work, The Dish of Orts by George MacDonald. And he opens up the essay talking, I mean, at least I circled in my first paragraph that he seemed to be describing for us modern education. Like when he was talking about the problems, like if we wanted to kill imagination, here's what we would do, right? And I read that, I was like, well, that kind of sounds like what we're doing, right? So Reno, why don't you get us going into this essay? And perhaps you have a few questions also for Danny before we even get going into the essay. So I'll let you share some of your thoughts there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted, before we jump into the essay proper, I wanted to kind of get a few more thoughts from you about levity, and especially as it's expressed as this kind of tension between a whimsy and frivolity, or the resisting of frivolity. The reason why I ask this is that in classical schools often can be very dour places. It's a very serious work that they are about. There's a restoration, there's a recovery, there is the cultivating of virtues. Classrooms and hallways are often, especially in the lower grades, they're seen as successful if they're orderly and they're silent. And I imagine that some people listening to this, when they hear levity or they think about whimsy, immediately the idea of transgressiveness comes to mind. I mean, indeed, Puck, right? Puck is in some ways a transgressive figure. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, obviously, MacDonald doesn't fall into this. And so in your readings of MacDonald and in your own scholarship, how do we hold the line between whimsy and frivolity? Maybe frivolity, the frivolous, is not necessarily a negative in this sense. But more importantly, how can we embrace whimsy and resist the transgressive in the negative sense? And also, if transgressive is something that you think MacDonald embraces, how does he kind of bring that into the orderliness and the harmony?
Yes, excellent question. Very difficult to give you a full, adequate answer to. I think one thing to say is MacDonald is a transgressive figure in certain ways and in certain respects. He's not as transgressive as, like an Oscar Wilde or something like that. Who I don't want to caricature because I think there's a lot of interesting depths there as well. But for the sake of this, you can sort of take that as maybe a type of whimsy, which sometimes can seem to be merely frivolous, merely for laughs or merely for jokes or something along those lines, which is probably what the classroom teacher is most concerned about. As I was teaching this afternoon, I was very much trying to quash the levity that was not properly directed. And I suppose I think what MacDonald would say, and we'll get into this, I think, with the essay, and I think he talks very directly to this, What he says is what we need is more imagination, and in a sense, we need more whimsy of a sort. But again, he always wants to he talks about not in this essay, but in uh, elsewhere, he talks about this idea of a spiral, of an upward spiral, and the idea of the spiral is precisely that we start as a child, and when we're a child, we have this sort of natural bubbling up enthusiasm and joy and all the sorts of things, but it also is chaotic. It also, it also is what turns into tantrums, and it turns into the negative side of things. And so you then progress up, and maybe it seems like you're progressing away from all of that, and you're progressing away from and you're just learning to control, and you're learning to suppress all emotions, that kind of thing. And what he says is that's a stage in the development, but then actually you return at a higher level to this, in a sense, kind of a similar stage that you were at before. You're kind of trying to progress to the place where you still have the enthusiasm. You don't want to lose the enthusiasm. You don't want to lose the whimsy. You want it to be cultivated. You want it to be directed and educated. And that's the whole point, right? That's the whole point of education itself, is to take that natural thing, which is one of the best things in all of us, is presumably is our passions and our emotions, which bubble out in all sorts of ways. Some in these amazing sort of divine kind of ways, and sometimes in demonic kind of ways. And obviously you want to select and to cultivate the proper ones. So I think what he would say is one of the big things for MacDonald is fearlessness, I would say. And so what he thinks of, what he would probably say to that educator who was worried about that breaking out is not that you should just let chaos reign or anything like that, but actually what you need is you need to cultivate it into a higher passion for something even better than whatever that thing is. Not denigrate that emotion or that or that location that from which that whimsy is originating. He says if you kill the source of passion, well, they're never going to be educated anyway. You've kind of killed the thing that's driving them forward to begin with. So that would be a start at an answer, but it would take a lot longer to fully unpack.
No, that's fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic. And there's a lot of things there that obviously are calling us into this essay. Before we jump into the essay, I just want to check something with you so that we can kind of put this out there for the listeners as well. And I hear you using the language of rightly ordering being associated with education, and rightly ordering kind of desires and passions. And in the church fathers and the patristic theology, and this is coming out of Aristotle, obviously, that the soul itself is divided into three pieces, is tripartite, right? And so there are this kind of hunky desires and passions, kind of like the big ball on the snowman, and then there's the thumos, or the thematic. There's the will, right, which is associated with the mind. So that's kind of like the middle portion of this snowman. And then, of course, there's the nous, which the medieval scholars, the scholastics, would later call kind of the active intellect, right? It's the thing that is shaping. And Coleridge, he calls this the primary imagination. Does MacDonald see this? Is this something accurate insofar as when we talk about imagination and facts and reality? Before we even do that in this essay, does Coleridge see that, or is there something else afoot in his kind of conception of the human soul and its relationship to the passions?
You mean, does MacDonald see that?
Yes.
I mean, MacDonald is never as systematic and clear as we might want him to be. I would say that he's definitely like there's parts in this essay in particular, and whenever he talks about the imagination, he sounds like Coleridge, and yet I think there's parts when he actually disagrees with Coleridge, and we can get into some of those specifics. So yes, he when he talks about the imagination, he means the largest possible sense. He means the thing that's closest to the actions of God at creation. That's how he defines it. And in that sense, it's close to Coleridge's primary imagination and some of those others. But I think MacDonald is wary of taking that too far. The divine, I forget the exact phrase, but the repetition of the divine I am is Coleridge's version of this.
Right.
MacDonald is always in this essay, which we're going to talk about, he very much takes a step back from that and says he's essentially hesitant to use the word maker or creator or creative for the imagination. He prefers kind of a slightly diminished sense of that, partially because he's preserving, I guess, the sovereignty and the action of God in some sense. But I think the other function of that is, as I always see MacDonald is not taking it quite as seriously as Coleridge does, in a sense. There's a sense it's like he doesn't want us to worship even the imagination. It's right. So even though the imagination is, in some sense, the highest function, he still wants us to, not therefore make it, because again, this would be my reading. There are other people who would very much say he's just imitating Coleridge here, but I would say he is undercutting a little bit the romantic, and therefore going back all the way to the Greeks, elevation of the imagination as humans getting close to on par with the divine, and the poet as sort of a semi-divine figure almost. I think he's wary of that.
This is fantastic. Okay, this is the segue into his essay, "The Imagination, Its Functions and Culture," because now we have this idea of whimsy, we have this idea of the imagination. We're bringing up terms like the soul and rightly aligning, and then very early on in this essay, he says that the main function that the imagination is aroused by facts, and that it helps us conform the soul to reality. These things don't seem to go together. Kind of when we think about the terms of reality, the way it's deployed today, when we think of terms like facts, we might think of Neil deGrasse Tyson. What in the world for Coleridge? How does he put these things together? How does he start this way?
I think one way to think about that is, and again, I assume you meant MacDonald, not Coleridge.
Yes, thank you. I did it again.
It's okay.
That maybe to back up a little bit, MacDonald was actually trained as a scientist. He went to Aberdeen University and he trained as a chemist, and he studied maths and physics, and he was almost he wanted to become a doctor. He wanted to go to Germany and study chemistry and sort of be on the cutting edge of that kind of thing, and they couldn't afford it. His family couldn't afford to do that, so he didn't. But he continued to tutor students in chemistry and physics and all sorts of things throughout his life. I mean, MacDonald did so many things in addition to obviously all of his writing things. He was himself an educator. It's part of the way he made money, and that kept his family going when he didn't have a steady source of income. So there is for MacDonald no ultimate separation between science and the imagination. And in fact, he would say very much so that science, and this essay essentially does say that science does not work without the imagination. You cannot do science without the imagination, and that. And that there's an interplay essentially, right? So one way of thinking, again, we sort of already sort of tried to frame the imagination as the big picture. The imagination, as he at one point in the essay, he talks about the imagination as the architect, and he talks about the intellect as the worker. And there's this sense in which the architect is the one doing the plan, is getting the big picture, the big overview, and the intellect, or again, you could sort of fill in there, the scientist is the one who's going in and doing kind of the detailed work of actually building the thing, or actually finding the details and the facts and all of that kind of stuff. But you can't, this we even in science you get this, right? They talk about theory, and theory is seeing. Theory is the idea of a big vision, and MacDonald would say that without the vision, without the overview, without the imagination, you can't do it. And so there's this back and forth between the fact and the vision, and the two are mutually informing each other, correcting each other. There's a dynamic interplay between those two things for him.
Wow.
I appreciate that you bring up the science. I didn't even know that about George MacDonald, but it makes sense now reading this. He focused so much on science. I want to say something to our teachers who are listening, that one of the things that really struck me about reading this essay was that I think this essay could be an important bridge for the classical teacher who is teaching history, science, or math. Often those teachers sort of feel lost in the classical education training, and they're like, why are we reading poetry? We want help with, how do I teach math classically? How do I teach science classically? And I think that this essay is probably one of the most important essays I've read that would encourage the science, the history, and the math teacher, because he talks directly about the imagination and its function within history, its function within science, its function within math, which is also why at the beginning of the podcast I mentioned a Mathematician's Lament by Paul Lockhart, because the message in that book is supported, I think, by this essay. So yeah, let's dive into the essay. And Reno, would you like to sort of walk our listeners through what the structure of this essay is?
Yeah, I'll give an attempt to do so, and then I'd love to kind of hear Danny's kind of summary of the essay, its importance in Coleridge's own work and its reception. But
George MacDonald, you said
Lord
Coleridge
have
again.
mercy. This might be like a public kind of like medical emergency or something.
This is so great. I love it.
The third time. Please forgive me.
Well, you're making the connections that are good. That's good.
Yeah,
you're making good connections.
there may yet be a medical emergency involved with this, so everyone stand by. Okay, MacDonald's essay, and I think what is really interesting is that it seems like the bridge between the function of the imagination and its culture. Still not sure what that is, but Danny's going to help us figure that out. Happens really late into the essay. MacDonald spends a lot of time in this essay just developing what is this thing, the imagination. And of course, he finally, after kind of summing it up in this incredible paragraph that we'll get to, telling us about the end of imagination being harmony, whatever that means yet. He then gets us to the culture of the imagination, and the development of which, MacDonald says, one of its main ends is the divine education of life with all its efforts and experiences. I have no idea what that means, but it's beautiful, and I'm excited to hear what Danny has to say. Danny, tell us more about this essay, what it meant to MacDonald, and even how it was received, any information you might have on that, and then maybe some more details just about the richness of this before we kind of move through it a bit more to highlight some details.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to answer one of those questions, which is maybe one of the easier ones to answer, which also I think stumped me for a long time. So by its functions and its culture, we obviously tend to use culture to mean, the society or the group of individuals. He literally means here its development, its nurture. So culture in the sense of, I don't know, culturing bacteria or whatever.
Right.
That's what he means by culture. So that yeah, it took me ages to figure that out. But it would have made more sense to the Victorians, but it's just the way that we tend to use culture. We don't even think initially that that's what he means, and of course that's where our word, where it originally comes from when we talk about culture. Anyway, so that was the easy one to answer. In terms of its, let's see, in terms of its reception, sadly, I don't think it has had as big an influence as it should have. It was he published it back in 1867, and I don't think it again received the attention that it deserved. Then he collected it, and it became the first part of this collection called A Dish of Orts, which A Dish of Orts was not it's not like a logical. He didn't write A Dish of Orts as a book. A Dish of Orts is basically a collection of things he published elsewhere. Is kind of what he means by a dish of orts. Orts are like scraps. Is literally what orts means. So a dish of orts means he's like collected all his scraps together and put them. So so it's also very self-deprecating when these are some, I would say some of his most brilliant things. But he's putting them together as sort of something that he hopes is going to nurture people, sort of feed us in some sense. It clearly had an influence on the Inklings, and leading into Tolkien. Maybe you could comment more directly on that. But I think there's a lot of his ideas here were picked up probably most prominently by the Inklings. Tolkien and Lewis and Barfield being most prominent, or at least the ones that most immediately come to mind. And so, it would be interesting to sort of see. I don't know if, again, my impression is that Tolkien is slightly, to go back to the distinction we were talking about with Coleridge, that Tolkien is maybe slightly more on Coleridge's side than what I was describing as MacDonald's a little bit greater hesitancy towards elevating the imagination too high. But maybe I could let you comment on your view of that.
Yeah, no, and also just so everyone knows, Danny and I both are graduates of the St. Andrews Institute for Theology, Imagination, and the Arts program, and we overlapped. I think it was a year maybe that we overlapped, or maybe a year and a half. So with Tolkien, like we don't have any records really of him having read this essay per se, and all the conversations are really about his fiction. Though, however, readers of Tolkien's work, and those of you who pick up this essay and then pick up Danny's book, will definitely see that there are overlaps in language. So even the language of subcreator, right? I mean, there's something in there. But with that term subcreator, I think you're intimating that it's more elevated than probably what MacDonald is comfortable with. And certainly maybe as ennobled as Coleridge was hoping for. Though I do think that philosophically and theologically, there's more connectedness to this. There's something kind of theologically ancient about what Coleridge is talking about here. This aligning of the soul is a very classical language, and that seems it's not sexy enough for a romantic like Coleridge. to maybe get into there.
Just to clarify, your first Coleridge was MacDonald and your second Coleridge was Coleridge?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I don't know why this is happening.
It feels like April Fool's here.
All for your generosity.
I love this.
And grace.
We should air this on April Fool's Day.
Yeah, no, this is wonderful. What we'll do actually is just dub it. So we'll have the audio engineer just dub MacDonald in there, and we'll just make it awkwardly obvious.
I think it's fine. I think this is great. It's fun.
Whimsy. There's our whimsy and levity.
There's our whimsy, right? I love this. We are gonna have to blooper this part out right here because I'm losing my train of thought.
I think we should lean into the whimsy and levity. I mean, this is, I think, and there's not. This is the thing, right? That there's not enough of this. And I think what's fascinating, and maybe you can save us in this moment, Danny. But like there's that the whimsy is a part of the creative act. Like it both conforms to, or it's aroused by facts, and there's a conforming of the soul to reality. But there's something about reality that is more than just the facts. It's more than just the things that we see. And so this kind of whimsy and levity allows us to kind of embrace it or even see it and touch it. I mean, what does that even look like? And how is that central to this essay?
Yeah, no, I think whimsy and fancy, again, Coleridge talks about the difference between fancy and imagination, and there's a slight sense of denigrating fancy as opposed to imagination. Right. And MacDonald does that a bit, and that does happen a little bit later on in this essay. And yet, I think what MacDonald preserves a little bit more is the nobility of the servant, I suppose. And there's a sense in which you don't get to imagination without fancy, and there's something you need just the little playful things before you can get to the grand, exotic, masterful kind of level. So I think that's probably one of the things that he would say, and imagination just, I guess, couldn't be, in a sense, without fancy, without that. And MacDonald is always, I would say, focusing, on the underdog or on the marginalized kind of figures within his fairy tales, within his works. And in that sense, I think he also tends to do that philosophically and theologically. This is one of the reasons, like one of the big things, he actually doesn't do it too much in this essay, but elsewhere, one of his core ideas is the childlike, and this idea of the childlike imagination, which is not just a romanticization of the child, I would say, but is actually it is somewhat, it's taking that idea of the child seeming to be silly and seeming to be naive or embarrassing or whatever happens to be, and showing that is one of the primary ways in which God, the conscience, and these other things function, because it's one of the few ways that God and God can kind of break through, so to speak, our human constructions and our human ways of presenting ourselves seriously. Like, seriousness is one of the great theological problems, because it's taking yourself seriously. And that is, again, MacDonald would say, going back, he wouldn't quote from Augustine, but it's kind of basically taking an Augustinian view of sin as enclosed on the self, as the inward bent of the self, of the soul on itself, and that is the core idea of sin. And so one of the most important things you can do is to not take the self seriously, and Chesterton has the great line about angels can fly because they take themselves lightly, and this is I think very much at the core of MacDonald as well. It's taking so much human sinfulness, or the problems of development too, right? The problems of learning, if we bring it back to the learning side of things, is fear of being seen as silly, or fear of shame, or fear of embarrassment. And we want to take ourselves seriously. We want others to take us seriously. And so we're so afraid of that we kind of, it's this closing in on the self. And so one of the other things that whimsy and silliness can do is break out of that, and particularly for people who take themselves too seriously, it can be a moment when God can actually, or something beyond the self can break in.
And I would think you're making me, as we're talking about whimsy, one of the fairy tales that to me feels the most whimsical that George MacDonald wrote is The Light Princess. It's very whimsical with her floating around, and it's hilarious when you're listening to I listened to it on audio, and I was laughing because it was hilarious the way it was describing her floating around. I thought, oh, my 4-year-old grandson would love to hear this story, because he would get it probably better than us adults when we're listening to it, right? Because he's in that realm of whimsy. Now, coming back to this essay, though, I felt that he was making a case for the imagination. I personally didn't see the whimsiness of this. I saw the imagination is to be taken very seriously in this essay. And I felt, and I would love to know, Danny, the audience to which he was trying to speak to, but I felt like he was, as Charlotte Mason did. When you read Charlotte Mason books, you feel like, oh, she's talking to us today because they were going through the same issues with too much testing and too much, fact-based education. And she was sort of pushing back on that and saying, well, we need to get outside more. We need to develop our imagination more. And so I felt like he was kind of speaking to the same people she was speaking to, who are so focused on this big push towards science, that he was trying to say, you can't do science well without a well-ordered imagination. You can't do math well. You can't do history well. You can't understand any of these well unless your imagination is cultivated well. So I felt like this essay was an appeal to teachers, which is why I think teachers today ought to read it. And I made so many notes where I saw connections to some things in Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. I saw connections to Norms and Nobility in here. I saw connections to Madeline L'Engle. That's why I said any of those authors. I think that this essay is very dense, but if you're not in the mood to read Norms and Nobility, this would be a good essay to read because it's not anywhere near as long as Norms and Nobility, but I felt like it delivers a similar message.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that I agree with you, that you always have to be careful, because MacDonald is never entirely silly, and he's never entirely like, there's always, in one of his other fairy tales, he says, when I jest, I always jest in earnest. And there's a sense in which there's always this tension between the two. It's because if you go too far down the jesting side and the silly side, it obviously degenerates in some sense into sort of pointless chaos. And if you go too far down the serious side, it calcifies into some immovable rock kind of situation. And so I will before coming back to your other point, I will just note he's more on the silly, frivolous side in his other essay, which concludes Dish of War. It's The Fantastic Imagination.
Yes.
That's the essay that he's probably, if the readers were interested in that angle, he's more clearly doing that in The Fantastic Imagination, which is a brilliant essay. And it's, if your listeners didn't want to read this one, which is a much more difficult essay, The Fantastic Imagination is kind of the light, playful version.
Yes.
which is still introducing a lot of the same ideas in a more in an easier to digest, playful kind of way.
I agree, Danny. And I think the fantastic imagination is another important essay for teachers. Like you said, if they don't want something quite as dense, it's much easier to read. And if you print it, it's only a few pages. In the fantastic imagination, I think teachers can learn a lot about how to properly approach a fairy tale, how to approach it in the classroom, approaching it like it's a sonata. You know, you're going to hear different things in it, and I really love that. Speaking of, I love that you said he jests in earnest. That and I picked that up in the Wise Woman at the very beginning. He opens up the Wise Woman saying, "This is a rather, unusual country," and then he goes to describe it, and I'm like, "Well, it's just like our country." And I felt like that's a good example of him jesting in earnest. If you just open the first paragraph of the Wise Woman is funny. But yet serious.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, describing this country, and then how the first thing that the baby did was to cry, and isn't that
Right.
surprising? So there's this sort of
Yeah.
He's just sort of describing our world. Absolutely. I think to go back to what you were saying about its importance for teachers. Well, maybe to take in a particular direction. I think one of the things that it really opens up, or really sort of for me points to, is the importance of reading, and the importance of space in education. So MacDonald is always he's always imagining space. So a lot of his stories are doing this. So at the end of the history of Photogen and Nycteris, for instance, that story ends. Well, the story begins maybe with the female character in a cave, and she gets out of the cave, and it's a sense of she was enclosed in this tiny dark space. And again, I think it's very much a metaphor for some people developing and growing and getting out. And she gets out into the nighttime, and she's just amazed by the moon, and she thinks the moon is the sun, and all these kinds of things that are going on. Anyway, but the story ends with her saying, maybe we too, once the day boy and the night girl have married, it ends with her saying, maybe one day we too will get out of this world into greater space. And MacDonald had this constant sense of space, and the imagination is providing more and more space for our soul, for our mind, in some sense. And I think that's one place for thinking through this carefully as teachers and educators, is providing enough imaginative space for students, for children, for adults to grow, to sort of exercise their own imagination. Right? It's not sort of just a rigid memorize this kind of thing, but creating those places and those spaces for individuals to interpret things for themselves. And that's that might be an area, again, I think this is where some people are often afraid, is giving students too much room to interpret. MacDonald would very much encourage teachers to give students room, space to interpret things for themselves. Not to say that he wouldn't correct it when it goes wrong, and that, but he would be less fearful of a misinterpretation. He is surprisingly nonchalant about people misreading his stories. He's amazingly sort of like, well, maybe your misreading is better than what I meant.
Yes.
And there's so few authors that I've ever read who say that. It's just like, authors are just usually want to just sort of come down and say, no, that's not what I meant. MacDonald does the exact opposite and says, he's very humble in that sense as an author. He's very much like, he trusts the reader. He trusts the reader, and he trusts that God is somehow operating within their reading to bring them to what they need right then. And he just sort of sees his role as, again, this is going back to the sub-creator discussion. He sees himself in this essay. He talks about not the poet, the maker, but the finder, the trouvère. And it's that sort of idea. It's a slightly more humble kind of role. It's a slightly more open kind of position, which allows greater, I say, greater space, greater opportunity, a greater role to the reader, and the author is less significant, and therefore, the reader has greater responsibility and has to do greater work, which is what then enables greater development, greater education.
Yes, I'm excited that you said this, Danny, and you brought this up. This is why I made the connection with Walking on Water by Madeline L'Engle, because she says a similar thing about that often the work, the art that the author has provided is going to do a work in the heart of in the soul of the reader that the author didn't even realize was there. And George MacDonald said the same thing in this essay, and I wrote it here in my notes for teachers. This is why we ought not ask, what is the author's purpose? That really stupid state requirement test question. What's the author's purpose? I remember a lady, a poet, a modern poet. Her poem was in the Texas state test a few years ago. And the question was, what's the author's purpose? And she read it. She goes, I don't even know how to answer this question. And I wrote the poem. So it's to say, and none of the answers even matched what she would have answered. But yeah, George MacDonald, I have this. He basically is saying that that there's that as an author relying on words being living, that they're living. He brings that up in Fantastic Imagination. That they're going to do a work that is beyond what the artist may have intended. And I really appreciate that you brought that up, Danny, because I think that's really important for teaching, for good teaching.
Oh, I wanted to, if I can, just kind of expand the conversation a little more, because in this day and age, the key buzzword. I mean, there's two of them. One is curiosity when it comes to sciences, which is in the medieval world a sin, and creativity. Right? And so it's very easy for someone to take this and feel really good about it and be like, hey, we need to foster creativity in our classes. We want our students to be creative. But there's this very specific anthropology at work in what MacDonald is putting forward here, almost the anthropology that fits perfectly with Charlotte Mason's pedagogy, we might say. And I'm wondering, there's two things that I'm wondering. So MacDonald says, to come now to the culture of the imagination, the development of it, as you pointed out, its development is one of the main ends of the divine education of life with all its efforts and experiences. Okay, so there's something more than just the creative and the fun and the personal. There's kind of an expansion of the possibilities of what reality is composed with. I'm wondering, Danny, MacDonald was a Scott Presbyterian, right? Does he interchange the use of imagination with the sacramental? Is there a yearning for a kind of a sacramental, being able to kind of touch and see the movement of God or the gods coming and going like the ancient Greeks had, being able to hear them in the rustling of the leaves? What does that look like, Danny? How does it go beyond the mere creative? And is there a kind of sacramental aspect to this as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Always depending how we define sacramental, but yes, right. In the largest sense, what he means by an imagination is that which, well, he defines one of its primary function as searching and knowing the things of God. So. So yes, he would not just sort of have this vague sense of creativity as completely untethered from a larger philosophical, theological framework. and for him, it's very much connected with the image of God. That it goes back to Genesis and that kind of thing, how humans are connected to God, and it's one of the primary ways in which we see the spirit of God's creation. And so when he looks at a flower, this is, it's kind of there is definitely a romantic element to it. He's not sort of like Wordsworth. He would sort of complain about murdering when we dissect things, and he would always want to, in seeing that flower, try to see what God meant by that flower, and so it wouldn't just be a catalog of what I can literally observe, or the colors, or the texture, or whatever it happens to be. And he speaks specifically about the imagination within, as connecting us with the divine at the seat of our soul. Let me see if I can find the actual passage. That's this idea that God sits in the chamber of our being, in which the candle of our consciousness goes out in darkness and sends forth thence wonderful gifts into the light of that understanding, which is his candle. And there's a sense in which what you do, one of the things that he's conceiving is that the highest form of the imagination is that which opens itself out, again, in this sort of image of greater and greater space. But in that, you're also opening yourself out to the divine. And you find kind of, and again, the imagery is always kind of slightly paradoxical, but within yourself, as you find greater and greater sort of space and move outwards in one sense, but also inwards, you find there, and you are able to receive these communications through nature, through material things, through art as well, through all of that. All of those are ultimately for MacDonald. Everything for MacDonald are messages from God. Everything. So yes, he's to connect to your. He was raised in a very Presbyterian background. The extent to which he remained Presbyterian is somewhat debated. He obviously he broke with certain aspects of that, but he remained within other aspects of it. And but yes, there's clearly that sense of God is in everything, and is not only in all nature. And this is another, I think, important point. He's in everything. He's in even the bad works of literature, for instance. God can use that. There's all sorts of stories. He has one story in which a little girl is reading some terrible piece of literature, and she gets the wrong end of the stick, basically, but it's still something that prompts her to do good and to be kind to another person. So God can even use terrible works of literature, which maybe is not quite Charlotte Mason's point, but for MacDonald, it's all God's message.
Right.
It's not just the pretty flower. And MacDonald has so much about ugliness in his stories, and how ugliness is not necessarily ugly. So in The Princess and in the Goblin, this is probably the easiest, or The Princess and Curdie in particular. You get these they're called the uglies, these monstrous creatures who are actually some of the best, most moral creatures in the story, and it's the humans who look good who are actually turning into snakes and beasts of all sorts and descriptions. So ugliness is not necessarily exclusive to being able to be a message from God. So God can use anything is kind of one of MacDonald's messages.
It reminds me of Tolkien in the Silmarillion, that the discord is sewn into the harmony. That it's not, nothing can stand outside of that reality. Well, that's wonderful. What fun. Adrienne, do you have Any?
Well, it's hard because I have the essay in front of me and I have so many annotations.
Oh yeah.
And it's hard to talk about the essay because there's so much. It's so incredibly dense. I have the word forms a lot, and I did notice that this was my third reading of this. And I'll say this to our listeners. I've read Abolition of Man 3 times, and now I've read this essay 3 times, and I feel that they both have equal importance. This one's never talked about. Abolition of Man is always talked about. But I feel that they both have a similar denseness to them, if you will. And I still don't fully understand it, just like I don't fully understand Abolition of Man. But I walked away from this reading feeling like for the first time I may have begun to understand what forms means. I've struggled with forms for a long time. And Reno, you and I have talked about this. And I think one of the reasons why I started to understand what forms was as I read this essay was that I was able to connect this essay to a lot of his stories, to his fairy tales. And I could actually see in my mind and feel in my emotions what he was trying to say through this essay because I've experienced his stories. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think that he does in his stories what he's talking about in this essay. Would that be right, Danny?
Yeah, no, absolutely. His I mean, and again, if you were asking a more general reader where to start, I wouldn't point them to this essay.
No, yeah.
So I would very much probably either the Fantastic Imagination if they want, if
Yes.
they were more on the essay side. But to be perfectly honest, it's much better to come to even the Fantastic Imagination having read his stories. And so I would always point people to the fairy tales first of all. I mean, of course, that's what I personally love and have worked the most on. But I also think they're something so. The reason why MacDonald's fairy tales are so amazing, I mean, there's so many reasons, but one is because he loved fairy tales so much. And MacDonald wrote so many things. He, is one of the most prolific writers of the Victorian period. He wrote um, uh, 2 volumes of poetry, like 1,000 pages worth of poetry. And he wrote, I can't even remember 20 some novels that are massive Victorian length kind of things. And 5 works of sermons or theology. And the list goes on and on and on. And it's not to say that he doesn't sort of value those and put a lot into those, but he has a deep passion for fairy tales. And it's like all the best in my mind comes out of MacDonald when he writes fairy tales, and it crystallizes so many of his thoughts. He literally, like, it's when his imagination is at its richest and is at its most powerful and vivid and concise, and at its least preachy, so to speak. MacDonald was a preacher in many ways, or he continued preaching throughout his life. And in some of his novels, he kind of can get very preachy at moments. But his fairy tales, he just, because it's like his imagination has risen to that highest level, I would say. And so I would highly recommend that if no one's familiar with the fairy tales, they start there.
I agree, Danny. I have the audiobook called Fairy Tales by George MacDonald, published by Naxos. And it is just fantastic. And the 2 readers are amazing. And I have stumbled into this deep love for the fairy tale called The Carousel. And I feel like that might be one of the easiest fairy tales to start with. So if we have a listener wanting to know where to start, the audio book is a fantastic place to start. If you do a lot of driving back and forth to school or picking up kids from school, and the children will love it. And as I've listened to these fairy tales, I've gotten this sense that surely he was writing these for his children because they're so fantastically fun that I'm sure he was writing these for his children. Do you even know?
Well, the only
you would know?
yeah, the only evidence that we have is Well, there's a couple things. He likely wrote The Shadows for the original version of The Shadows was written as a Christmas family publication. So everyone in his family wrote something for Christmas, and so we know that he wrote that for this Christmas sort of publication. The first time he collects the fairy tales by themselves, most of his fairy tales are published in other things. So he has a novel called Adela Cathcart, in which he publishes some of these as their stories. They're sort of interpolated stories into the larger narrative. But when he publishes them by themselves, he has a preface in which he says, "You know that unlike other papas, I do not tell you stories." So it's a very strange thing for him to say. He basically says, I've never read these two before. And whether or not that's true is hard to say. Is he, again, how playful is he being with that preface to his children? But what I would say is, I think it's almost like he wrote these because they were so important to him. And it's not to say that I don't think they weren't important to other children as well. But unlike somebody like Lewis Carroll, who clearly, the Alice stories started as telling them to a child, to entertain a child, I think that's less clear with MacDonald. And
MacDonald was friends with Lewis Carroll. And that Alice in Wonderland came out of that. And I know that the first manuscript that Lewis Carroll wrote, he gave to George MacDonald's wife, said, please read this to your children. And then George MacDonald gave him many notes back and said, you need to expand this story, right? So I think it's brilliant. And I see in the story cross purposes, it feels a lot like Alice in Wonderland to me.
Yes, absolutely. Cross purposes predates Alice in Wonderland, as does The White Princess and quite a few of MacDonald's stories. But yes, we don't know if this is actually true, but according to Greville MacDonald, George MacDonald's son, one of the first readings of the stories was to the MacDonald family, and it was Greville MacDonald who said something like, there should be 1,000 books just like this one, and high praise from the MacDonald family helped encourage the publication. Well, probably he would have published it anyway, but there certainly was a strong family connection. Lewis Carroll, who was into photography, also photographed the MacDonald family and children on numerous occasions. There's lots of times where there's letters between them, and so they had a really strong relationship. And I think Fantastes predates Alice in Wonderland, and there's a lot of I think similar echoes and imagery that Carroll is drawing upon from a lot of MacDonald's works. So.
Yeah. Reno, do you have any more thoughts that you want to bring us back to the essay? Do you want to bring us back to the essay? I know there's more thoughts in there too.
No, not at all. I just wanted to I just came across this quote within the essay. MacDonald says, speaking of true learning, Lord Bacon says, it taketh away vain admiration of anything, which is the root of all weakness. And I think just again, this kind of just bringing us back to the essay and to his kind of larger project and the way that it intersects with levity and the importance of understanding the way that the imagination functions as something that belies our undeserved worship of the mundane and the ordinary and the merely natural. That there's a reason why we read these stories to our children. We're helping them learn to see. Right? We need to learn to see, and without it, we are literally walking blind through the world. And without it, we're merely worshiping the things of creation rather than expanding that world. And so this is, I don't know, this to me, this is has been wonderful. And I hope that people see the possibilities and are able to see the possibilities for their schools and for their curriculum, and to imagine new ways that their children can move and be and learn in schools beyond the merely obedient and the merely compliant. So there's some transgressive for us to add to the levity that I brought to today's episode.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the close to the end of the essay, and if you guys want to add to this some parts that I guess a quote that I think would be important to say is right before he starts talking about the culture of the imagination. He says, "The end of imagination is harmony. A right imagination, being the reflex of the creation, will fall in with the divine order of things as the highest form of its own operation." And I felt that that was important to towards the end of the essay to talk about what the end of the purpose and the end of imagination being harmony and in a rightly ordered way of thinking and
I wonder if you could put that whole paragraph in the show notes, because
yeah, I should because I think it's really important. And over through this essay, he really does talk about the divine order of things, and it kept making me think of Augustine and the rightly ordered, everything being rightly ordered, our loves being rightly ordered, and I felt like this was very much tied to that. Danny, do you have any closing thoughts on the essay?
Yes, maybe to close kind of on the note the essay itself closes on, which is not. I think it's making the same point that you were just making about the harmony, the imagination connecting us to this divine harmony, and yet at the same time, what it does is slightly undercut that language, as MacDonald always likes to do, because he talks about it as he says, thus to be playfellows with God. So this language of harmony is wonderful, and I think it's true. And I don't think MacDonald is, he's not really, but MacDonald is always moving us on from fixating on one kind of idea, and particularly a really high one that can make us feel very serious about things. And I love that. I absolutely love that he ends on that. Thus to be playfellows with God in this game, and he talking about the whole thing in that language of play and that language of game. I think restores the joy of it. Restores the joy of education, of development itself. And he talks about us. He talks about everyone as the children, the children of God, the child of the kingdom. They pour upon the lilies of the field and gather faith as the birds of the air. Their food from the leafless hawthorn, ruddy with the stores God has laid up for them. Right. So there's this idea of all of it. Science is God's game for us, and math, and all, and history. It's all sort of this wonderful play that God has created for us to delight and enjoy in this world.
Yes. Oh, very, very well said. Were there any other closing thoughts we wanted to share with our listeners in general?
That is a wonderful ending. The only thing that could be more funny is for me to say Coleridge one last time. So,
yeah, that's funny. That is funny. Danny, I didn't prep you for this. I apologize, but I usually like to end my podcast asking if there is a book you wish you had read earlier in your life, or a quote that has had a lot of meaning to you. If you can think of anything, I'd love for you to share that. I apologize for not warning you ahead of time.
A book I had read earlier in life. MacDonald would probably be on that list. I didn't really read MacDonald until until university. So I didn't read any of MacDonald's. It's slightly ironic that I spent so much time on his fairy tales when I didn't even read his fairy tales. I found MacDonald's fairy tales. I had a sort of a magic moment finding MacDonald's fairy tales when I was at university. There was this. I went to a small liberal arts college, Reno College in Virginia, and there was this beautiful old bookstore that had used books and kind of typical kind of piled up and things falling over and all that kind of stuff. And I was wandering through with a friend of mine, and I remember discovering MacDonald's fairy tales, and I'd heard of MacDonald through Lewis, like most people. And suddenly I didn't know he had written fairy tales. And there was this, it felt like to connect into something Reno has mentioned earlier, the Michael Enda moment, never-ending story, where he finds this book in a bookshop, and it transports him to another world. And that was my discovery of MacDonald's fairy tales. I wasn't able to hide out in the bookshop and read it, but I did. That was sort of the moment that I discovered it. So on one hand, I wish I had read it as a child. On the other hand, I'm very happy with having that moment as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Tell us a little bit about your book, where people could find it. And also, does the George MacDonald Society have a website? And tell us, before we close, what kind of resources they offer.
Yeah. My book is just called George MacDonald, Divine Carelessness and Fairytale Levity. You can find it on Amazon or wherever you like to buy your books. The George MacDonald Society has a website. Am I going to remember what it is?
We'll put it in the show. Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes.
If you just search George MacDonald Society, it'll come up. It has a lot of resources. It has a lot of connections to his works that are available online. It has some background biographical information. I'm hoping eventually, although this probably isn't immediate, to put some stuff for teaching, to put some teaching resources up on there. Again, I think that's one of the most important ways of promoting MacDonald would be to get him out to teachers a little bit more. So I'd like to do that in the future. And there's also links to have you heard of Malcolm Geit? He's the president of the MacDonald Society, and he's done various he does spells in the library. I don't know if you've ever seen his YouTube.
Yes,
so it's links to that, and there's a few events that it links to that we've done online that we've posted on YouTube and that kind of stuff.
Oh, this is great. Well, Danny, thank you so much for this conversation, and for Reno, for you helping to co-host us.
Thank you for inviting me
through this. It was lovely, and I really appreciate your time, and I'm sure this episode is going to be a joy and a blessing to many. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Danny.
Yes, good to see you, Reno.
You too.
Thank you for listening. You can get involved in a few ways. There's a Facebook page where we actively discuss the ideas around classical education. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/classical education. And if you want to help offset our production costs, you can support the podcast financially by going to www.classicaleducationpodcast.com/support. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once said, "Well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be in a few words this: they will know what it is to see the sky, they will know what it is to breathe it, and they will know best of all what it is to behave under it as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven."